Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 101, Not Your Rabbi's Judaism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And in this period around our 100th episode, we are looking at some of the bigger ideas that have had a major role in Judaism Unbound over the first 2 years of the podcast. So today we'll be focusing a lot on what we've been talking about in terms of folk Judaism, or what I sometimes call the people's history of Judaism. And our guest is Barbara Thiede. She is a teaching professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She holds a PhD in history and teaches a number of courses on a variety of topics, ranging from the Hebrew Scriptures to women in Judaism to magic to the Holocaust. She does an incredible job weaving together these various ideas, and we're really excited to talk to her. In addition to being a professor, Barbara Thiede is also known in the Jewish renewal world as Rav Shulamit Thiede. She is an ordained rabbi in the Jewish renewal movement and is a member of the Vaad of the Aleph ordination programs. That's essentially the board that oversees the education of rabbis in the Jewish renewal movement. But you'll be surprised at some of what Rabbi Barbara or Shulamit Thiede has to say about Rabbinic Judaism and about rabbis. So we're really excited to jump into this conversation with her. Barbara Thiede, Shulamit Thiede, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, it's exciting because we will now have had the people who performed both Lex's wedding and my wedding on Judaism Unbound, so it's really great.
That's, if anybody's wondering how to be a guest on the show, that's all you have to do is perform a wedding for Dan or I. Done deal.
There you go.
So we're really excited to have you on the show in this refocusing on some of our bigger ideas that we've explored, because we've talked quite a bit about various critiques, various thinking that sort of comes within the world of Rabbinic Judaism. And we've also talked a lot about the ideas that we've called folk Judaism, that the people kind of have a different perspective potentially than the rabbis. But even there, I think we often are looking within a sort of world that's set up now here in the 21st century. It's a world that's sort of set up still within the context of Rabbinic Judaism. And your writing really questions some of that. And I think it would be really interesting for us to get a snapshot of kind of what is your perspective on how Rabbinic Judaism fits into Judaism.
What I have to say about this is actually hardly new. What is new is to hear it in seminary settings, in congregational places, in places of Jewish life. Scholars have known for decades that we have no objective proof that there was any group of rabbis who saved Judaism in the first century of this common era, and that in fact, the rabbis later on created a series of myths that were so powerful and so amazingly compelling that once, and here's the scary moment for some of us, once the rabbis are given in part their role by a rising Christian empire in Jewish communities, that becomes the narrative of what Judaism is, that becomes the identity of how Judaism is practiced, and all of modern Western Judaism lives in a place where every yardstick that is applied to what makes us Jewish becomes a rabbinic yardstick. But that rabbinic yardstick is relatively to our history new, and it is relative to the extraordinary diversity of Judaisms throughout our history, rather a narrow yardstick to be using.
I love the yardstick metaphor because yards themselves are a form of measurement that are not universal. Most of the world uses meters, of course. And so I think it's a perfectly apt way to look about this, that a yardstick of rabbinic Judaism is not the full Jewish yardstick. I'd love for you to sort of flesh this out with a concrete example that you used about kaifeng, which was in an essay that I read of yours that really spoke to me. And I'd love to hear from you about this interesting, often overlooked Jewish community in China that sort of helps to hammer home the points that you're talking about.
The Kaifeng Jews appear to have sustained a life in Kaifeng for about 700 to 800 years. They came via the Silk Road, probably 9th or 10th century CE. And this was a community that lived without Talmud, that lived without halacha as Western Jews would know it, and yet created a vibrant and rich Jewish world in which patrilineal descent was how you counted your Jewishness, not matrilineal descent, in which Confucian sayings and even Asian practices around ancestor worship became part and parcel of Jewish worship. Yet these Jews, clearly identified as such, they had their scrolls of the Tanakh. We don't think they had all of them, but they had the 5 books of Moses and many others that became a curiosity for Christian missionaries in the 1600s. And they survived with their own synagogue. Even today, Kaifeng Jews, this tiny, tiny existing remnant, do not eat pork. They circumcise their sons. They mark festivals. And sometimes when you look at the way that they marked festivals, you've suddenly stood at something you know as a Western Jew and seen it in a wholly different light. So if you look at the texts that they write about Yom Kippur, a day of reflection, a day of improvement, a day of becoming a better person, right? The things that we hear from the rabbinic world, the fear, the awe, self-denial, none of this is the prevailing way that these Kaifeng Jews are celebrating Yom Kippur, and yet their Yom Kippur is just as it is for any other Jew, a critical, high, holy day of the year.
So when we look at the sort of rabbinic myth, right, the basic idea is that the temple was destroyed in the year 70, and there was a period of instability, and in some fashion, a group of rabbis got together, a group of probably Pharisees, which was one of the sects back then, got together and became the rabbis and reimagined Judaism, kind of along a similar line to the way that the Pharisees were talking about it before the destruction of the Second Temple. And out of that emerged rabbinic Judaism that became the next version of Judaism. And maybe here and there are some isolated communities that wandered away before that rabbinic Judaism took hold, and so that there are some of these outliers out there. But basically, rabbinic Judaism is Judaism. And so I guess, could you kind of help us understand what really was going on historically? Because I think that you're clear about both how we should understand what was going on before the destruction of the Second Temple and in the years after the destruction of the Second Temple that kind of make it clear that that's not really the right way to understand what was going on.
I'll do that with the historian's caveat, the one that I give all of my students, which is that in 20 years you could find out that I lied to you and that I didn't know, right? 20 years from now, we'll know differently than we know now. And I will also do one other thing, and that is add to the mythology you've just described, Dan, because there is a branch of Judaism. If you go on Chabad website, what you'll find is this idea that the rabbinic project actually is not saving Judaism, but keeping an old, long-standing line going, right? That's what they do, just by writing things down, by getting together. And so all of this actually well predates the first century. So you've got these two essential narratives that they save Judaism by creating something cutting edge and new. And that sort of Chabad world definition, they preserve what was already always there. But in either case, both these narratives are myths. They have little to nothing to do with any of the history of what I would call then Judeans rather than Jews. Alone, our terminology is off. The word Jews is a word that doesn't really get used for our people until the Common Era, and the first people to use it are Christian patristic fathers. They're the one using that term in the way that we then come to adopt it and use it for ourselves. So Judeans, the reason that I emphasize this is because these Judeans have already been in diaspora for hundreds and hundreds of years. They've already been building synagogues across Asia Minor, across Europe, across the entire Roman Empire. They have already created communities in which they are defining and redefining what their practice is. They are an ethnos, a people group, and they have inherited a set of traditions. They have inherited ancestral narratives, and they have inherited, to some extent, an important identity marker in terms of the genetic sense of where they came from. Even if they've been living in Alexandria for hundreds of years, they still may be marking themselves as Judean. They also may be protesting that marking as Judean. But start to finish, prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, these Judeans of Rome, of Alexandria, of all of these amazing different settings, have been living without the temple as their central binding institution. They have been living with, around, and in company with Roman and Greek and various other cultures, Persian cultures. They freely adapt to the cultures that are keeping them company. They also quite clearly will defend things that are important to them. The right, for example, not to have to worship the emperor. And they're living lives that actually are so vibrant and attractive that we have a number of records of Roman writers getting a little worried about the amount of Romans who are actually adopting Judean practices. Seneca and Juvenal both do this, both say, oi, we Romans are not observing our ancestral practices. We're doing things like those Judeans over there. So these lives are lived vibrantly, richly, mostly peacefully. Our ancient forefathers and foremothers were living pretty interesting lives, which I will also say include much more power, input, and activity from women than any of us would expect, including women leading synagogues. Also, much and very interesting interrelationship with people who are attending synagogues who are not Jews. So we have this incredibly vibrant life. The literature of Second Temple times doesn't indicate, in fact, almost none of it ever mentions the temple. So the whole saga that once the temple is destroyed, right, everything falls apart. Jewish life is broken into pieces. There's this desperate longing and agonizing over the future. There's no evidence of that. It's a rabbinic story. It's a rabbinic myth. And that myth, of course, exists in part as a foundation story to explain how the rabbis become important and why they should have. Insofar as we do have rabbis speaking to one another at little groups, discuss the law, yeah, they do that, but they're talking to each other. And they have absolutely no role, or almost no role to play, in the lives of the vast majority of Jews in the first centuries of the Common Era. So people aren't consulting the rabbis on legal issues. They're going to their local Roman legal officials. Their marriage contracts are not being written in Hebrew. They're being written in Greek. Children are being named with Greek names. Synagogues are not built according to rabbinic strictures. They don't have things in the right directions, doors in the right place. And Jewish community life that is taking place in those synagogues is not taking shape according to a rabbinic direction of any kind. Instead, people are fundraising, people are manumitting their slaves, people are getting together for festivals and having fun. They're living Jewish lives, but they're not living rabbinic lives.
I want to push even deeper and just underscore on 87 levels all of what you're saying, so that anybody who doesn't fully internalize is given the best chance to do so. Because I feel like some people could be listening, and some listeners may have never heard anything about this, about the history that we're talking about. Others might say, I've heard a little bit, and I knew there were other groups around in those early centuries. I've heard of things like the Sadducees or the Essenes. There's certainly an awareness from certain communities of Jews that there were others out there. But I feel like many of them sort of look at that as if, those folks were dissenters, or or even if they weren't quite dissenters, the fact that they ultimately didn't sort of quote unquote win means that we might in later eras need to look at them as sort of holding a different level of authenticity or something. I don't know. I'd love to hear just if you could really underscore what this time was like, and how all of these groups, and maybe sort of non-groups, just people out there that wouldn't have called themselves any of it, were engaging with one another and with Judaism.
So the first thing I'd like to say is that something that many of my students find really challenging. Let me put it in a comparison. Frequently when I've gone to churches for various interfaith moments, I've been asked, well, look at what happened with Christianity, how it spread throughout the world. What do you have to say to that? So we all know the subtext, right? We won and you didn't, right? So this is clearly an indication that God wanted this rather than that. You are the that, we are the this. And, my answer to that usually is the fastest growing religion today is Islam. Or Constantine could have converted to Judaism. There were about the same number of Jews as there were Christians in the Roman Empire about the time of his life. Accidents of history are interesting things. Choices that are made are interesting things. And when we look back at this time, so first of all, I want to say that the list, Sadducees, Essenes, Dead Sea Scrolls, is kind of the classic list of, there were Judaisms. It's a Jacob Neusner kind of approach to this, Jacob Neusner, the great historian. But even those groupings are really not representing 95% of Judeans of the Second Temple time or the first centuries. They are very specific little communities, right? And here's how this gets back to that question I get asked by Christian communities. When people do the rabbis won, I want to say, And had it not been for the emergence of Christianity, which literally created an incredible power base around church and around clergy, and then also created a compelling need to know, who are the leaders that look like us in that minority community? They are the rabbis. In some respects, we can thank Christians for the rabbinic power that we enjoyed, benefited from, and which defined us. And I say all those words in positive terms because I want to make it clear that my intention is not to say this was all mythology and therefore we don't have to pay attention to it. The rabbinic narrative and the rabbinic frame has been absolutely critical and formative to Western European Judaism. It is also, in many, many respects, an extraordinary, beautiful, rich tradition, which deserves a lot more attention than we give it as well. My problem is, or my concern is, that in a world in which Judaism has been measuring itself by that yardstick, has been beating itself by that yardstick, instead, we have the opportunity to look at this grand diversity of our history and tap a myriad of sources that are rich, variegated, and worth our time. Conforming to the rabbinic one and reinvigorating the rabbinic model is not our only choice for Jewish identity, Jewish life, Jewish community, and Jewish future. The Western Ashkenazi-dominated world needs to step back and take a little bit of a dose in humility and learn. It needs to learn a little bit about its own history so that it stops reading rabbinic history as the equation to Judaism per se. And it also needs to explore deeply and listen deeply to Jews of other countries, other traditions, and other worlds. Then we need to have a conversation, all of us. All right. So what is it that none of us, I ask my students this, right? What is it that you would never give up about Judaism? What would that thing be that is so visceral to who you are that you can't imagine yourself or any other Jew without it? Start there, right? And for some of those Jews, it could be halacha. For some Jews in the world, it is rabbinic halacha. And for some Jews, like our Kaifeng Jews, it might be the books of Torah mixed in with a little Confucian wisdom.
Is it right to say that there's, or is it a version of a right thing to say, right, that there are at least two traditions that have been in play, even in the Eastern European Ashkenazi world, for the last 1,000 years? One is the rabbinic elite tradition that has gone in different directions. It's gone in the direction of having more focus on law. It's gone in the direction of Hasidism, which a more focus, let's say, on the spirit. It's gone in the direction of Reform Judaism with more of a focus on social justice and in various other directions. But it's all versions of that elite rabbinic tradition. And that's one way to sort of look at what's happened, or that is one thing that has actually happened. But at the same time, in parallel, there's actually another tradition, and it's the tradition of the regular Jews who sometimes follow what their rabbis suggest and sometimes don't. I was talking to a group of rabbis recently where I was trying to put out the idea that it's really important for rabbis to have a vision of their own role as a rabbi, but it's also important for rabbis to understand that the people also have a vision for what Judaism is for them. They may not always know how to or even want to bother articulating it, but it's wrong to say that they're just ignorant and don't care. It's often that they actually do have a real deeply felt sense of what it means to them and what they want Judaism to be, and they're actually feeling just as let down by the rabbis as the rabbis are feeling let down by them. I was just wondering if you could kind of help us think that part through, because it's definitely been a theme that's recurred a lot in our conversations.
Well, the first thing I want to do is add, there's more than two, right? And the third piece that we need to be thinking about is the extent to which Jews of any world, Western or otherwise, are also integrally involved in surrounding cultures. If you just take a look at, go back and look at Joshua Trachtenberg's old classic on Jewish magic, right? Of course, he says it's all about folk practice, and then he quotes one rabbi after another as his sources, which is his own kind of like commentary on what you've just said. But still, one of the cute little pieces in there is how women of the medieval period would want to have some iron in the room when they were giving birth, right? Like this was really important to get a key to the synagogue. Get a key to the synagogue and have it in the room of a birthing woman. But if there was no key to the synagogue available, you could ask for the key to the local church. We need to think about that, right? So understanding the complexities of our history is actually like opening up a magic treasure box. There's so much there sparkling for us to look at. And it goes beyond, here are the elite rabbis in their various forms, and here are the people, doing whatever they're doing. Interaction with cultures, peoples, music, art, experience, economies around us also has played a role in how we create and recreate ourselves. One thing I do want to come back to, though, which is really important, you use the words about, the people being ignorant, the people being, today, one of the things that drives me most personally into the corners of my room to bang my head against the wall is when rabbis talk about the ignorance and the apathy of Jews. First of all, new. What's new, right? Like, when were rabbis not complaining about the ignorance and the apathy of Jews? Like, this is, you're saying something new for us? Don't think so. But the other thing about this is, according to whose model are these Jews ignorant and apathetic? According to which yardstick are they uninterested? I look at people of Lex's generation, of my son's generation, those Jews, yes, many, intermarried, and definitively still describing themselves as Jewish because it's important to them, and still finding ways where they can sit down, and maybe they don't know what they're saying when they say traditions. But they do know this. They do know that there's a people group they belong to. They do know that that people group owns traditions, ideas, texts, ways, folk practices. They know those things. And they are actually often much more literate about what that really means in defining Judaism than we give them credit for. It's just that they may not necessarily be primarily interested in what we think we have to teach, which is the rabbinic model as the be-all, end-all, form that we will preserve Judaism in. In 1,000 years, Dan, I really wonder whether rabbinic Judaism will look, maybe even in 500 years, to Jews at that time, very much like we look at Second Temple times, if we look at it at all. Oh, that's interesting. That's how they were.
I've mentioned in the past multiple times on the podcast my own wrestlings and journeys around the role of rabbi, both historically and today. And in doing so, I've cited this guy who ran for lieutenant governor in Rhode Island solely on the platform of eliminating the lieutenant governor position. So he was running for a position that he wanted to tear down so that he could save the state of Rhode Island the amount of money that was the lieutenant governor's salary. Interesting political platform, but I bring it up because I sort of feel sometimes like I'm looking to become a rabbi to like tear down what the role of rabbi is understood to be. And part of why, I mean, we mentioned at the top of the show that you performed my wedding, and there's lots of reasons why that happened. If you're looking for somebody out there, folks, Rav Shulamit Thiede. Yeah. But like one of the reasons was that I feel that you share a lot of those wrestlings and are also in this so you're already ordained as a rabbi, as somebody who, even though you are a rabbi, you're able to sort of step outside that perspective and question what the role of a rabbi is. And so I guess I'd love to hear, because so far it's been about, history and others. I'd love to hear a little bit about you and how you, while critiquing all of these historical and contemporary manifestations of rabbinic authority, are also a rabbi and wrestling with all of that.
You were right. I do wrestle with that. I find myself sometimes frustrated with colleagues because of the tendency, which we all have, this is going to happen in any profession, but there's a kind of self-congratulatory process that I find is dangerous if we want to be the kinds of paradigm shifters we keep saying we want to be. I'll never forget one year somebody said, on Tish B'Av, the festival that in the summer months when everybody's going on their summer vacation, we should be sitting in shul and mourning the destruction of the temple, both temples, a day when we're conscious of loss, a day when we speak to the anguish of the destruction of Jerusalem. Those are all real things that also really happened and were associated with pain. But this particular rabbinic student was suggesting we celebrate that day because it gave rise to the rabbis, because without this day, we wouldn't have had the great experiment that the rabbis created. And I remember looking at the listserv and thinking to myself, well, if you want to make sure that you're important, yes, this narrative will also be really important to you. But what if you sit down to Hanukkah and instead of telling that narrative of Hellenism versus Judaism, which tends to very much reinforce a rabbinic narrative around the dangers of assimilation, and you turn it on its head. In a congregational setting, you have everybody sit down to a table, and on the table, you have different things on everybody's plate. A couple of them are mock coins, the ones with the goddesses and gods on one side and the menorah on the other. Maybe there's a shtukala philo, a little piece of philo. If you've ever read it, that'll give you a different sense of what Judaism could look like in the first century when, a bunch of philosophy was applied. You have on every single plate, and you do this in your own private home, right? In your communal home. Every single plate, you have evidence of this kind of, not battle between one kind of world and another, but the way these things were being lived together You have everybody get their Jewish names for the day. And if they're living in Alexandria, those names might be Philo or Alexander, not Judah, not Joshua. And then, after you do this, you look around the room. You look at the art in the room and the furniture in the room. Is all of that Jewish? What happens when you walk through the house? Do you see some Jewish things? You surely do. Do you see a lot of things from all over the world? You might. What kinds of Jewish lives are the Jews who own that house, who are living in that house, living? In what way are they, just like those of 2nd century BCE, integrating, joining together, exploiting even the riches of the cultural worlds that are at their fingertips, and still remaining Jewish? What kind of Hanukkah would we be celebrating? And then at the close of that night, everybody brings their Hanukkah to the table and we light the candles, because some things are eternal and they last forever. And one of those things is how incredible a light looks in the darkness. I want to make it real for my community that Jews and Judaism is that treasure box. I want to make that real for them. And I don't want to do it in a way that measures their practice. They have more practice than they know. And I think that the history that we have gives us that opportunity to think as rabbis in those settings, Lex, as people who can encourage everyone in the room, even ourselves, to ask, what is Judaism? What do I love here? What makes me feel at home? And we can do it almost as friends, because we ourselves, you and I, will be continuously asking that question of ourselves, too, as we should, rabbis or no.
I sort of have a question for both of you that comes out of this conversation, because I think that the three of us have made, somewhat different life choices, but coming out of the same mindset, because I think that the mindset that we're describing here is one in which we're seeking a Judaism that is, let's say, primarily emergent from the needs and perspectives of regular Jews, which at least you and I, Barbara, have been for a long time before going in and going on to a Jewish professional course, whereas Lex went on to that Jewish professional course at a younger age. But I've tried very hard to resist the idea that I should become a rabbi, because I have said, look, I essentially accept the perspective of the myth as you've kind of given it to us. I mean, the notion that this is a myth, right? That there are many different ways to go. And wouldn't it be important for those of us who are saying, we want to kind of explore the Judaism that comes from that other line, to create our own set of understandings of what that leadership looks like and what we call it? If I were to become a rabbi, then I would almost be pushed over to the other line, and that there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a different line than the one that I'm trying to live within. But it strikes me that you're also trying to live within the same world and the same line that I've been trying to live within, and yet you pursued and wanted to have the role of to be a rabbi. And I'm wondering, and you too, Lex, like, how do you think about all that?
Every year in Jewish Renewal, when we ordain our people, we read a lineage. And the lineage is a fairly traditional lineage, except that, God bless him, Reb Daniel Siegel added women into that lineage. You just inspired me to think about the lineage of Rufina. Rufina, the Rosh of a synagogue, right, in 2nd century CE. The lineage of these human beings, the lineage of the God-fearers, the lineage of the elders of Alexandria, who had to navigate the horrible violence of 1st century CE, the lineage of the Jew in Alexandria, the young Jewish man who describes himself as an Alexandrian when the local authorities describe him as a Judean. He says, no, I'm an Alexandrian. We've got that.
I'm a Polish Jew, Bernie Sanders.
Amen, right?
I'm a Polish descended American.
Exactly.
Yeah, Polish American.
There is a lineage here that needs to be claimed. And I think actually that there's part of me that wants to run out and find all the Daniel Liebensons out there and say, not only claim it, name it for yourselves, look for it, identify it, and lift this lineage up. Because yes, the decision to enter rabbinical school, I felt that I needed that world to establish the credentials. I think if I were doing this now, I might feel differently. But at that time, there was a credentialing issue. I suppose that to some extent, I walked into that world, loved that world, and do love that world, and have walked out inspired to credential your lineage, Daniel. That's what I want to do. In the way that, like Lex is saying, become a rabbi in order to take it down. I think what I want to do is from the rabbinic space say, guess what? We needed you. We need you now. And to do what I can from that space to say, you are authentic in ways you don't even know yet. Let me support that.
For me, the lineage I think about and that I've mentioned in the past, I love what you just framed, and I love citing the lineage of Rofina. I've talked about this. My lineage is the lineage of Korach. I love the lineage of the heretics, and I think of Korach in the Bible as like one of our first obvious heretics who is understood by his own leadership and by God and by later eras of Jews as being other and being different from the ideal. And it's not that I am doing nothing that would be deemed ideal by Jewish authorities, but it's that there's enough of me that feels like I actively want to shift what it means to be a Jew and what are the ideals of Judaism, that I need to be in the conversation where that's happening. And so at a certain point, I decided that going to rabbinical school would help me to do that. I have some days where that feels like the right call, and I have some days where that feels like I'm entering into something that would best be achieved from outside of it. And today I'm not so sure. Next week I might be more sure. But I bring up heresy because I think there's a choice to be made of whether one is going to claim that what they are doing Jewishly sort of is the thing. Like, by going to rabbinical school and being me, I'm sort of claiming this is what Judaism is. And then when a Christian asks me, when a Jew asks me, when whoever asks me what Judaism is, and I talk about myself, like I'm answering their question. It's not that I am saying what I do and saying, oh, that's what I do, and then Judaism is this external separate thing. And I feel like that's right for me. The project I'm on, in a sense, is changing what Judaism is by being the different Judaism. I will be ordained, God willing, I will be ordained, somebody willing, or God willing, depending on the day, rabbi, and I'll want to not use the title rabbi a lot of the time. But I also want to use it sometimes. And so by doing it, I have both options. And so maybe I'm between the two of you. I don't know.
Not necessarily. I have to say that I almost never introduce myself as rabbi. People do respond differently to me when I put my hand out and say, it's nice to meet you, I'm Barbara Thiede, than if I say, I'm Rabbi Thiede. If I earn the right to be a teacher for our people, they give me that right. And I have to re-earn it every single day. I have to earn it every single week. No title grants me that right. It is my fellow Jews who grant me that right.
In terms of what we're talking about of rabbis and non-rabbis, we're sort of setting this up as almost a binary and two lines that should somehow be at odds with one another. But what I think we all really want is some moving forward where we say can we sit together as equals and hash out a new path forward? And, I think it's interesting to ask rabbis and non-rabbis what that path forward might look like.
You're putting me in mind of this moment in which the Forward published rabbis' comments on, essentially what is the greatest threat to Judaism. And a high number responded with apathy and ignorance and all of this. Boy, there are times you talk about turning the collar. I'd love to sit rabbis down in a room and I'd say, okay, and now your task is just to listen. And you're going to listen to the educated, articulate, interesting, creative Jews that walk through this door. And you're going to take for a moment your expectations about what you think Jews need to do to be Jews. And you're just going to listen to what are they doing? Like, in what way is their existing practice really fulfilling ritual expectations that you think have to start by opening the Siddur, right? In order to have that conversation, I think, Daniel, one of the things that's most important for me is to get rabbis, forgive me, to be quiet, to listen a little more, right? They're used to doing a lot of talking. I'm used to doing a lot of talking. We could listen a little bit more. And just spending the next, 50 years listening to Jews, listening to Jewish children, listening to the interfaith families, tell us what they're doing and how they're doing it, we'd have a lot to learn from that.
I'm hearkening back to where we started this conversation in terms of the discussion about diaspora and if I remember right, in the essay that I read of yours, you spoke about and questioned whether even diaspora, the word, is the right way to look at it if they weren't entirely relating to the land of Israel or the temple in the ways that we have mythologized. They being Jews in earlier eras. And I'd love to think about that in our contemporary conversation, because I feel like so much of what goes on now is Judaism as relationship to Israel, as relation to people, state, and land of Israel, for people in Israel who live there, and more commonly and more importantly for our context in the United States, even as people outside of Israel. And I'm speaking politically. I do think, and we've spoken about and will speak about all of the ways that has political ramifications for Jewish communities, for Israelis, for Palestinians. But I'm also not even just speaking politically, because we seem to have built up for ourselves this idea that nothing we do outside of the land of Israel can ever really be as deeply or authentically Jewish as those who are doing it in closer proximity to Jerusalem or to the wall, the Western Wall, or to whatever ideas of history that are located there. So I'd love to hear from you on that, because I know historically that's also been a huge question, how people around the world relate to their Judaism, the extent to which they do or don't think about Israel, and also how that plays out today.
I don't know that the term diaspora can be divorced from the idea of grief, of longing, and of exile by most Jews today, right? That I think is really hard for them to do, because the mythology has put diaspora together with a set of emotional conditions, right? And it's in our liturgy, it's in our prayers, it's in our narratives, it's in our stories. But if I look at the history of the time, I'm not seeing that set of emotional conditions applying to the life that people are living in diaspora. As I said earlier, the Second Temple literature doesn't mention the temple at all, with one exception, apparently the letter of Aristeas. Otherwise, we're writing about other things. So what would happen if diaspora was for us now not associated with the grief, the sorrow, the longing that we should feel, or guilt, but rather part of a self-conscious and confident choice to expand the reach of Judaism all over the world, and to do so with enthusiasm, with joy, with creativity, with life? What would happen if that's what we meant when we said diaspora, right? Because it seems to me that's what Second Temple Jews were doing. So it's been done before. And I think that that's important for us to acknowledge and to think about, because we live in a world that needs our attention to the world and to conditions in the world. I've had colleagues who've said, when I went to Israel, I felt like I was standing on holy ground. It's holier there than any place else for me. And I deeply respect that they felt transformed by something. But I live in a world where there is no ground that is holier than any other. And I need to be conscious of that to be the best Jew I can be for the world. I am not the Jew who thinks, oi, we're assimilating, we're dying out, we're at risk. I see instead, when I look at our history, an extraordinary capacity to recreate and reinvent ourselves. I think Judaism will do very well in the future, and I have no fear for us, because we have great gifts that we possess, and we have great learning to explore, and we have great creativity we have yet to tap.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great episode.
I'm so glad. Thank you.
And thanks, of course, also to you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we want to close it out in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, we always love getting emails at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that you can always support us financially with either a one-time gift or a monthly recurring donation. And you can go with either of those at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.